Hi guys and welcome to my channel. Myself Dr. Akshay, and in today's session I'm going to be discussing about the topic primary active transport. If you guys want to learn more about the transport of substances through the cell membrane, then click subscribe and the bell icon. So let's do this together. Coming to the topic primary active transport. So among the substances that has been transported by primary active transport are sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions, hydrogen ions, chloride ions, and many other ions. So the active transport that has been studied in detail is the sodium-potassium pump. So this sodium-potassium pump is a pump which transports three sodium ions to the outside of the cell through the cell membrane, and at the same time pumps two potassium ions from the outside of the cell towards the inside of the cell through the cell membrane. And this pump is responsible for maintaining the sodium and potassium ion concentration across the cell membrane. And this pump is also responsible for maintaining the negative electrical voltage inside the cells. So, see this figure. Here, the carrier protein consists of a complex of two separate globular proteins. And in this globular protein, this larger subunit is known as alpha subunit. And the smaller subunit is known as the beta subunit. The smaller subunit, that is this beta subunit, anchors this protein complex in this lipid bilayer membrane. Whereas this alpha subunit has two main important functions. The first one is this alpha subunit has three binding sites which is facing towards the interior of the cell for binding three sodium ions. And second one is that this alpha subunit also has two potassium binding sites which is facing towards the outside of the cell membrane. And the inside portion of this protein, that is near to sodium binding site, has ATPase activity. That is, when two potassium ions bind on the outside of the cell membrane, and at the same time when three sodium ions binds on the inside of the cell membrane, this ATPase function becomes activated. This activation of ATPase leads to the cleavage of ATP molecule, thus leading to the formation of ADP plus inorganic phosphate. And this inorganic phosphate which has been formed is a high phosphate bond of energy. And this liberated energy can cause a chemical and conformational change in this protein complex, thus leading to the extrusion of three sodium ions which has been binded over the inside to the outside, and at the same time intake of two potassium ions which has been binded over the exterior to the inside. For some cells such as electrically active cells such as nerve cells, 60 to 70% of the energy is devoted for transporting three sodium ions out of the cell and at the same time pumping two potassium ions into the cell. So during action potential, massive sodium influx occurs. At the same time, massive potassium efflux also occurs. This massive intake of sodium ions will lead to depolarized state. And at the same time, this massive potassium efflux can lead to repolarized state. So for restoring this balance, sodium-potassium pumps plays a major role. So in this case, the sodium-potassium pump pumps three sodium ions out of the cell and at the same time pumps two potassium ions into the cell. So next, coming to how sodium-potassium pump is important for controlling cell volume. So one of the most important functions of the sodium-potassium pump is to control the cell volume of each cell. So without the function of this pump, most of the cell will swell until they burst. So inside the cell, there are large numbers of proteins and other organic molecules. And these proteins and other organic molecules cannot escape from the cell. And most of these proteins and other organic molecules are negatively charged. And these negatively charged proteins and other organic molecules will have a tendency to attract positively charged ions, such as sodium ions, potassium ions, etc. And all of these positively charged ions will have a tendency to attract water molecules into the cell. And if this process is not checked, the cell will swell and at last it will get bursted. So the normal mechanism for preventing this outcome is the sodium-potassium pump. This sodium-potassium pump pumps 3 sodium ions out of the cell for every 2 potassium ions which has been pumped into the cell, thus removing excess positively charged ions out of the cell. Also, the membrane which is present in this sodium-potassium pump is very less permeable to the sodium ions which are present over the exterior of the cell. So thus when sodium ions are pumped over the exterior of the cell, they always have a strong tendency to stay there. And thus this process represents the net loss of positively charged ions out of the cell, thus contributing to the extrusion of water molecules out of the cell along with these positively charged ions. Next, coming to primary active transport of calcium ions. So another important primary active transport mechanism is the calcium pump. So calcium ions are always maintained at an extremely lower concentration in each and every cells of our human body. So this extreme lower concentration of calcium ions is 10,000 times lower while comparing with the extracellular fluid. So this level of maintenance is mainly achieved by 2 primary active transport calcium pumps. So one of the calcium pump is present over the cell membrane, and this calcium pump pumps calcium ions towards the outside of the cell, and the other calcium pumps calcium ions towards one or more organelles which are present inside the cell. They are mainly sarcoplasmic reticulum which is present in the muscle cells and mitochondria which are present in almost all cells. So these are the main cellular organelles towards which calcium ions has been pumped. So in each of these instances, this carrier protein penetrates the cell membrane and functions as an ATPase enzyme. And this ATPase enzyme which is present in the carrier protein cleaves this ATP into ADP and inorganic phosphate, which is similar to that in case of sodium-potassium pump. So next, coming to primary active transport of hydrogen ions. So primary active transport of hydrogen ions is important at 2 different places in the body. So the first one is in the gastric glands of the stomach, and the second one is in the late distal tubules and in the cortical collecting duct which is present in the kidney. So coming to how primary active transport of hydrogen ions occurs in the gastric glands of stomach. So at the secretory end of the gastric glands or parietal cells, this hydrogen ion concentration is increased as much as million-folds. So these hydrogen ions are released along with chloride ions to form hydrochloric acid which is present inside the stomach. So next, coming to how primary active transport of hydrogen ions occurs in the late distal tubules and cortical connecting ducts of the kidneys. So in the renal tubules, special intercalated cells are present in the cortical collecting ducts and in the late distal tubules. So these intercalated cells transport hydrogen ions by primary active transport. So these hydrogen ions can be secreted into the urine against a concentration gradient of 900-fold. So that covers the topic primary active transport. I hope you guys learned about this particular topic. Thank you so much, guys. See you guys in the next session.